Okay, good. Thank you very much, Jakob, for the introduction, and we are quite happy to introduce you this piece of work for the extended Anthropolis work we are doing related to the future of urban mobility, and we are going to have a look at the potential of matching personas. I will explain just a bit later what it is, and the synthetic populations we are using for simulation. So that's basically what we are going to present at the design conference, and a bit more outlook for this work. So what was our initial questions? We were wondering in our joint work with Sebastian and Tjark, if we could find some synergies between synthetic populations and persona-based approaches, because we had the feeling that they were somehow quite related for different purposes, and they could, in fact, strengthen and complement each other. So that's an example of personas we developed for a workshop from last year. So you've got some examples here of archetypal persons who are going to have certain behaviors and certain characteristics. And they can be adults, but also children, as you can see on the pictures. So just to give you a little overview, the idea behind being that personas basically are used quite a lot in user experience design to develop product and services propositions, and that synthetic populations are mainly used by data scientists for simulations and also multi-agent simulation in mobility. So starting with personas, these are models that are used in design teams, and they're modeling fictional users of different types. So the idea is to represent the reality by archetypes of users, and they serve and they are very useful for communication, but also to design for this kind of people, to kind of feel empathy for the personas and to be able to design the services for those people. So most of the time they are built quite qualitatively, and you can see here a template you can use from the web to build a persona with his goal or his or her goals, frustrations, his motivation in life, his personality, biography, age, a name, and so on. And the development of the persona will be, of course, related to the topic we want to explore. So most of the time they're very qualitatively shaped, and that could be, that is something that is pointed out in literature, that sometimes they lack a solid empirical grounding for building them. So we don't really have a rational or a very quantitative way of building them. So to generate more data-based persona, there are some approaches. We can name basically 3 streams: collecting survey data to be able to build more statistics. Well, I don't manage it. A statistical way of building personas. We can also retrieve existing data from different sources and try to merge them to build the personas. And we can also iterate between conducting interviews or having very ethnological ways of having a look at real people and try to extract some archetypes from that and combine that with survey data. So here you've got an example of this more computational way of building personas in a recent paper from 2019. And basically the idea is to generate a persona population out of existing aggregate national data. And this was implemented to the case study was on building personas for taxi drivers in Brazil, if I remember well. So from that, they extract, they managed to build a I will not manage that, statistical population of personas, and to extract a small set of personas with this data that is about 10 or 15 personas. Here we go. And on the front of synthetic populations, what is it and how is it used in multi-agent simulation? So I'm not the expert of that part, so I will give you just the streamlines. These populations are digital representations of a real population that are used for to describe mobility patterns for the population, and it is based on various types of algorithms to be able to build this population. And usually, and that's what was done for this study, we are able to build a population that is representative of 10% of the, for example, 10% of the actual population. And so we are, in both ways, we are representing real people in a synthesized way. And we can see there are common attributes between personas and synthetic populations, but they are not really practically connected together from literature and from what we see. And we can see there are quite a lot of challenges in doing that. So that's why we tried to tackle this question. So that's the proposition. So on the left-hand side, to build the synthetic population for simulation, it is based on quantitative data. We're going to see this the kind of data we're going to use. And on the other side, we've got the personas that are really helpful for ideation and for solution design based on qualitative data, maybe interviews, and sometimes quantitative data. And basically what we want to do is try to connect them both ways here. In one way, strengthen the persona generation thanks to the population here. And the other way around, possibly inform more the synthetic population generation by some more qualitative insights from personas. So that's what we proposed here. That's the basis for building synthetic populations with the classical inputs, census data, transport surveys, company registries, spatial information, and the output being a certain number of individuals that are defined with their socioeconomic profiles, some activity chains, and some resources and personal constraints. And in order to have multiple personas, we're going to cluster this population and to build the persona based on the clusters, and also adding some qualitative inputs to do that. So we did a little try, a test to study the mobility in Paris. So for that, there was an existing synthetic population of Paris, which was generated in another study. And so this population was clustered into 8 classes with this kind of Gaussian mixture model here. So you've got the classes here represented for the population. And if we take the example of cluster 5, then we got half male, half female. The average age is around, I can't see quite clearly, 75. And basically here, quite logically, we are looking at retired people, right? And we can have a look at the means and the proportion and the distribution of each cluster this way. So when we take a look for Paris, then we've got also the attributes regarding the living area. So here you've got the main attributes for all the clusters. And you can, for example, notice that cluster 4, the age is between 8 and 19. So that these are the young people here in this cluster. And the colors indicate the darker occurrence or the darker probability of living in an area or another in Paris. So from the center to the extreme given by the arrondissement. You've got the numbers here, the districts in Paris from 1 to number 20. Okay, let's go. Okay, so what did we do? In fact, for this first study, we didn't build the persona from scratch, but we took qualitative personas from a study which was really based on the study of the change of lifestyles for Paris towards 2050. And we took the personas because they were based in Paris and they were quite detailed. And we wanted to see, so they were described and elaborated for 2016. So we've got, I think, 12 or 13 of them. Some are couples. And we've got some of the information for the personas are defined. And we wanted to see if we could match that to our synthetic population clusters. So that's what we did, testing the age and also the position, the work stages of the personas. We checked and adjusted the living areas and tried to match the personas to the clusters. So here, from the different personas, so I kept the colors were kept for couples. We could see that we could, in fact, affect the personas to the different living areas and to the different clusters this way. Okay, so for this first part of the work, we proposed a framework to be able to navigate between synthetic population to personas, following a rather data-driven approach, and the idea being to be able to collaborate to enable the collaboration between UX designer and data scientists. And there are, of course, two directions to be able to design products and services for a certain set of personas. That's the product or design-oriented outcome of this work, and also be able, in the meantime, to simulate some individual behaviors for the same set of personas and be able to have a look at the behaviors at another scale. So we explored this possibility to do that for the Paris area with 13 different personas. And what we were able to do is to enrich the definition of the personas with their living areas being statistically representative, and in the meantime, make synthetic populations more tangible by illustrating what the fictional persons could be behind this population. So this is allowing to do what? To create future personas, because that's something we have in mind. Our idea behind is to be able to have projections about the future. So we are thinking of doing that, adapting that to build future personas, but being especially careful to avoid a mismatch, because as we saw, the synthetic populations are based on current aggregated data, or maybe data from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And then when we make future projections, there could be a mismatch. So this has to be taken into account. And this leads us to the second part, which will be presented, by Tjark.
So I'll move around the camera for a moment. Thank you very much, Flore, for that. So this was a little bit the first part, and this is also what was part of the conference paper, which was mentioned in the beginning. But then this is really just the basics. So what we wanted to see in the first stage is how we can combine the different parts, but while working on it and also while discussing it, we realized that there are different ways how we can extend it. One of them is the integration of activity change. I will talk about it a bit more in a bit. Then is the reversing of the process. So I will explain that further as well, but it's about not starting with the persona, or not starting with the synthetic population and moving towards the personas, but using the personas in order to supplement the process of developing synthetic populations. And then finally, the application to future scenario planning. So this is our broader scope of work, let's say, and how we can do that between different disciplines. So between the design discipline and between simulation and so on. To start, so when we talk about activity chains, there are at least 2 experts here for activity change, which is Sebastian, who is online one of the co-authors of the papers, who is, however, I think with a little bit of a restriction of his voice today. So if we say something completely wrong, please feel free to correct in the chat. And otherwise also Tarek will be able to supplement here. But the idea behind activity change more or less is for the multi-agent based simulations, or the agent-based simulations, that we have a lot of different agents based on the census, based on the travel service and so on. And they have different routes throughout the day. So what you see here is for one of the clusters, which Flore was presenting before, the most common and the distribution of different activity chains. At the bottom, you see HWH, which means home, work, home. So this is for most clusters, the most common activity, because, well, this is what we do. Then you have a second one, which is just staying at home. So in most days, or in the average days, you're not leaving. Then you have home, education home. So for example, going to school, going to universities and so on. And it goes further and further. And as higher you go in most of the clusters, as more complex they become. So you have a certain percentage, let's say maybe 1%, 2%, which go from home to work, from home to school, no, to shopping, to home, to leisure, to home. So this is a little bit the idea, I think, also behind the agent-based simulations, to be able to represent this complexity and not just assume people going from home to work. All right, what does it mean for us? For personas, it's super interesting because you can take these. If we take, for example, the 5 most common ones, we can supplement and assign or attach these information to the personas. So if we develop 5 personas, or if we assign 5 personas from the cluster which we took here, we can say, well, all of them are at home, but we can take a specific home. We can take a home which is spatially located. they have certain activities which start at certain times. So it's not just that they go from home to work to home, but also when they do it and where they are located. And with that, we can represent already 45% of the population. So we can really build personas in the mobility context, which are much more specific, both in the sense of geographical information, on time information, when do they leave, how long will they be at a certain place, and so on, which I find already quite interesting. But this is, let's say, one direction, which then also now you will see very similar distributions of activity chains between the different clusters, because they haven't been integrated in the clustering mechanism or in the clustering approach before. But also this might allow to cluster people differently, not just looking at socioeconomic profiles, but also, let's say, at the complexity of their trips each day. This is the first part. So this is what we're currently working on to edit. The second part is the reversing of the process. So this is what we mentioned. We started the easy way, more or less. We started with the synthetic population and went to the personas. But now, while doing that, we realized that using the personas in order to supplement the synthetic populations might be quite interesting as well. So what we are currently working on is to start, well, we cannot just start with completely qualitative personas, and we cannot build only on personas which have been created for different purposes. So we are starting with the census data, for example, such as age, location, the income group, the household size, and so on. We supplement that with qualitative input. So this is again, for example, changing values or the lifestyles, or I don't know, can be a lot of different elements which can be collected, for example, through interviews, through surveys. And both of these together feed the creation of personas. So there are a lot of different methodologies already which exist around, at least a lot on the qualitative part and some also on the quantitative part, as Flore presented earlier. So we can develop personas from that. And then that is where it becomes even more interesting, at least in my opinion, is where we can check if the personas make sense. So if we look, for example, at travel surveys exist on the national and also on the more local level, and they take a certain percentage of the population and look when they go from where to where and what kind of behaviors do they take. So if we manage to explain differences within the travel survey through within the same socioeconomic group, within the same age group, within the same gender group, through different personas and different values, we can validate in the first place the personas. And if it is not the case, then we can go back more or less to the persona creation and try to improve it up to the point where we are able to represent not necessarily a majority, but a large chunk of the varying travel behaviors. And if it works, if it makes sense, then these things together can feed and inform the synthetic population, which in return can inform the simulation part. But this so far all talked about today. And then, as Flore mentioned already before, we're also trying to work in the direction of the future. So to see how different urban mobility scenarios might look like. And what we are using there a lot is scenario planning. So what we are currently is here on the left side, and as further we go, as more different possibilities there are. It's not the core of the discussion today, but on the synthetic population and the personas, what we talked about so far was the present. But if we want to go, for example, to the year 2030, we don't just want to have one, because we don't know necessarily what is the exact population size or the exact behaviors, but we want to have a variation between different ones. So we can have specific synthetic populations and personas which are representing a certain future. And how could we do that, or how are we trying to do that at the moment? On the first place, this is the simulation of 2 to 4 future demographic scenarios. So we can assume, for example, depending on which area we are working on, the population growth, the aging, the decrease of household size, and so on and so on. So there are a lot of methodologies which exist around that, which is more or less, I don't know, demographic foresight or forecasting. And secondly, we use qualitative input. So there's a lot of work on, for example, the study which Flore referred to earlier on the lifestyles in Paris in 2050 is one of them, which is trying to explore what different trends exist and what changing values we will have in 2030 and 2050, how lifestyles will change. Will the majority of people go to work, or will we have more complex activity chains and so on? And then use this in order to generate personas. So if the same approach which we used for the present resulted in personas which can represent the variation within the real synthetic population or the real anti-synthetic population. Then replicating the same approach for 2030 should also lead to a more or less sound methodology, which then again we can link to the information of travel service. That's a little bit the tricky part because the travel survey is still from today or from the recent past. So the question there is, in how far can we, for example, scale that up through the census data or adapt it slightly while still focusing on the qualitative input, let's say, from the personas. So this is a work in process arrow here and work in progress. And then leading to one or several synthetic populations for example, 2030. And to summarize that part a little bit, this goes back to the initial diagram which Flore was presenting earlier. So at the moment you have the separated process on the simulation side, quantitative data, synthetic population simulation. On the other side, you have the design part for idea generation, solution design, and so on. Focusing on qualitative data, partially supplemented with quantitative data, leading to personas and informing the process. What we are proposing is to, first of all, combine this into one workflow. So both of them can work together, which is more or less what we are doing at the chair. So combining work from different disciplines, from different angles in order to supplement each other's work and use both quantitative and qualitative data. So improving at least the personas, hopefully the synthetic populations. And in the second place, and this is where it becomes, I think, more relevant because there we are lacking for sound methodologies at the moment, is translating that into methodologies for future application, for example, 2030, to see how we can at least have one synthetic population for the future, one set of personas, or preferably several, in order to have a bit of a variation. And by proving more or less that the first one works relatively well, being able to replicate it at least in a more reliable manner for the future. And this brings us to the discussion, the conclusion. So first of all, we started with the data-based, the supplemented persona creation process. So even that is already something which I think supplements a little bit what we have been doing so far. So having personas with activity chains, with locations, and so on, with additional information, which we didn't have before. Secondly, exploring more the cross-disciplinary links between design and simulation, trying to integrate them where possible and where it makes sense. Then validating the personas through the matching with travel survey data. So this is more or less where we are working on at the moment. And this is, I think this has several potentials because it really can provide more sound methodology for the persona development, which allows us also to increase its application, because personas can be criticized like any other methodology as well, but mostly because sometimes they're very qualitative, so we don't really know where they're coming from. So we can check that they do manage to represent a large chunk of the population. It's already quite a success. And then, well, this is also the work in process. So this is also more the side of Sebastian. So I will not say too much about it, but the idea there is to then maybe supplement or develop a second approach to generate synthetic populations, which include more value-based, more qualitative input and so on. And finally, trying to lead to a workflow which we can use in order to develop different sets of personas and synthetic populations for future scenarios. And we hope that this will improve both the design and the simulation part of urban mobility solutions, the design, the testing of different solutions and so on, both today as well in the future. And then I think here are the references we have in the presentation. Otherwise, you can also reach out to us and we can share the preprint of the paper of the conference, which will also be public, I think, in a month from now. And with that, I say thank you, and the slides are gone. If you have any questions, please feel free to